Hello everybody, welcome to this topic, which is topic 11 on financial management. Over the next little while, what I'm going to try and do is cover the importance of what we call both finance and accountancy in the context of a community enterprise. So this session has been organised by me. I'm Bridget Kerwin here, and I've been working with small community enterprises for a while as part of the work that I do in TUS. And so this topic is huge, and the idea of presenting it in a short space of time I think is probably going to not do more than just introduce some of the key concepts, all of which will need some substantial more work from your perspective later. So I suppose this quote I found, and I think it brings across some of the concepts that a community enterprise is dealing with. It said, in the context of finance, it says to support decision making in a VUCA, what they call a volatile, uncertain, complex and ambiguous environment. The languages of their argument is that accountancy and finance are invaluable. So I think this quote brings across two things, is that actually we're working in community enterprises are all working in relatively complex environments, and where there isn't as much certainty as we might want or like, and where everything is changing. And then the concept of what they call accountancy and finance are really important things to give consideration to. So by accounting, we talk about how we keep records of and assure transparency for the business. And then finance is how the business, the community enterprise, is funded, which is really critical for the organisation, both of which are really important. Both of these concepts or ideas. And in practice, probably a lot of people walk away from them or are uncomfortable with them, but it is really important to become comfortable with, or to ensure that somebody within the community enterprise or that you have access to is really comfortable in this space. So in this topic, what I'm going to introduce is, the importance of business sustainability and the strategic plan and its role in this whole financial management end of it. We look at how you finance your community enterprise. What are the sources? The dilemma probably here is that I'm only really referring to an Irish context. In reality, there will be similar but not the same kind of funding models in each of your countries. So accessing these will probably be really important and required afterwards. The third topic we're going to look at is financial management, how we make sure that we have clear vision of what's happening with the finances in your organisation, and associated with that is kind of day-to-day good practice principles around record keeping and compliance. So we're going to cover these topics in the next little while. But as I said, I think a lot of it is going to need a lot more work from within the organisation. So in the last while, you've been looking at this whole issue of governance. And when we look at funding, we can't travel too far away from the same concepts. So the first idea is kind of creating your strategic plan. This is a clear picture of the direction of the business. It's key in keeping focus on what's the purpose of the business is, and acts as a guide to decision making that's appropriate for the business. So later on, we're going to see, when it comes to financing and funding the organisation, the existence of a strategic plan is really critical, because what it does is it says to a potential funder that this is the direction this organisation is taking. It's very clear about its own direction. It knows what it's doing, and the strategic plan provides that security for a funder or a financer later on. In real life, the strategic plan will probably be somewhere between 3 to 5 years of a direction setting piece for your organisation. It will need to be supported by annual plans, and the idea is that you create one of these every year. Its purpose is, again, to keep the focus on what it is you want to do, but also to identify the goals to be achieved for that year. And with that will be, how will the business know if it has achieved those? The annual plans, again, we'll come back to them a little later on when we talk about budgeting. and they're really critical again when we talk about funding. I'm conscious maybe that the language we're using is implying a level of complexity, and for a community enterprise, the process of the strategic plan and the annual plans at an early stage should be kept simple, but it should involve the key stakeholders, and it also should be written down. Sometimes people will say to you, well, it's clear in my head, but actually that's not good enough, especially when it comes to accessing funding later on. Another thought, kind of just as we're heading out into this topic, is that at each stage of the community enterprise, in focusing or putting the funding or the financing lens on it, each stage brings its own challenges. At the startup stage, the key issue is probably funding the development of the startup. It's important or essential to have cash, and sourcing the funding to allow the business to get from zero to trading in some shape or another is critical. And as I said, later on when we look at the sources of funding, that would be important. At a startup stage, the other key element excuse me, in setting up the system is setting up systems for everything, for operations, for purchasing, for sales, for marketing, production, finance, decision making, participation. All of these are the key elements of it. So you have to think of a system ensuring good governance practice for all of these, even if it's as simple as cash and petty cash, like who has access to it, how can it be accessed, how it can be recorded. These will be important. The other thing that a startup experiences is the idea of being required to make projections for 3 years down the road or 5 years down the road, when in actual fact the business has very little knowledge of precisely how this is going to work. But you do have to make some projections into an uncertain future. And then as you move into the early mature stage of the building, you'll have developed systems for managing all the finances and all the purchasing. But later on you'll discover what works and doesn't work, and that will help change as it goes along, will be required to change. Income streams will have been developed, like whether it's through grants or bank loans or hopefully directly through sales. Costs will have become clearer. You will know exactly your cost of production, your overheads, your staffing, whereas at the early stage you have to make some predictions about those. At the early mature stage, managing the income and costs will be essential. Producing monthly at minimum accounts, having money to continue development then will become essential. So the business will need to continue to grow, and having a profit, or the language we'll use later on is a surplus, is key. Then as the business matures, everything in terms of the business system will become established. Income and costs will be clear. There should be some level of accumulated profits or a surplus, accumulated surpluses as we've gone along. And the challenge will be projecting into the next stage of development. What products have been successful or not so successful for you. And we will reiterate the importance of accumulated profits in helping fund the next stage of your project. So how do we fund it, or where does the funding come for the early stage of development? In this case, this diagram is meant to illustrate, I suppose, the various fundamental sources. On the left hand side we have debts or loans, which you are mostly familiar with, like term loans, using credit cards in some kind of way, not necessarily to be recommended other than for short-term funding, peer-to-peer lending, and social enterprises, community enterprises can be places where there's essentially support for other community organisations, friends and family at a very early stage, and invoice financing. Invoice financing is where essentially you sell the debts that you have to somebody else, and they'll give you short-term funding on it. It's a particular way of looking at things. But mostly for community enterprises, in the short run, you're trying to avoid accumulating large quantities of debt in some kind of way. And I suppose essentially at the beginning, like, you're hoping that there will be what are called grants available, Pre-sales are the kind of idea, you know, where you hear sometimes people have pre-sold their books, so they get the money in before the business starts up, or before the book is actually in the shops, and that's the idea of a pre-sale. And grants then in Ireland, we have an organisation called Rethink Ireland, which are one of the sources of funding or grants. When we think of grants, there can be grants for particular things, and so not all of them will come, the grant funding may not all come from one particular source. But I suppose in an Irish context, a lot of the grants are funded through some fund or other, through different kinds of organisations. And Rethink Ireland, for example, have a social innovation regeneration fund and a hybrid social finance loan. And that's one of the grant sources that they have. Now, again, these are loans and not just grants, so they fit in kind of between these two. So then there's the concept of what are called angel investors. These are people who will support maybe your community enterprise. There is a concept in Ireland, kind of, this is an organisation that connects Irish entrepreneurs with angel investors, and people can be there to fundraise for particular projects. An angel investor generally wants some share of the company, but will also provide a lot of support in it. In Ireland, we have a TV program around angel investors. You know, people who you pitch an idea to them, and they potentially will like your idea and provide support and funding for it. Then we have venture capitals. By and large, these are not used that much for social enterprises, except that in Ireland we have access to a company called Nexa, who talk about social venture capital. Now, their interest is in projects that are social/environmental, or have benefit to society or the environment in particular. But that is one kind of venture capital. The traditional venture capital funds generally want to loan very large amounts of money, like $250,000 upwards. But this Nexa are interested, as I said, in particular kinds of projects. Then the concept or idea of incubators and accelerators. In Ireland, we have an organisation called Community Finance Ireland. Like, they're one of the key sources of funding for social/community enterprises, and are an important source of that. Social Impact Ireland, again, is a company that doesn't provide finance as such, but does provide a great deal of support in terms of the idea of an incubator, or if you like, advisors to a social enterprise. So that's really important. Again, we have friends and family here. And then lastly, an idea that's relatively new is the concept of crowdfunding, where you can use a crowdfunding tool or mechanism to raise some funds. And this gives you an idea of one of them, this raise funds tool, or this raise funds organisation, Spark Crowdfunding. Schools use it in Ireland for developing, say, sports pitches or things like that. So it's one way of getting your some of the costs associated with the community enterprise across the board. And as I said, I'm conscious that this is actually an Irish context rather than yours, and you may have similar models in your own country. So when it comes to any of these funders we've been talking about, or any of these funding sources, in reality, the community enterprise will need, like, all of these. So obviously the completed application, this one is for Community Finance Ireland, but you can see those pieces that you were talking about in governance, why they're important here. This is a copy of the memo and articles of association, in other words, how you set up your community enterprise. They'll want to know who the current directors are. And one of the recommendations in terms of directors is to make sure that you have somebody, as I mentioned earlier, with financial expertise on your board of directors. Then they look for 3-year signed accounts, financial projections, again, which I'm going to mention, and cash flow, which is absolutely critical for all businesses, particularly community enterprises, and then the bank statements. So what I'm trying to say is that like all of the pieces that you've been speaking about up to now are critical when it comes to applying for funding. These will include salaries, rents, electricity, maintenance costs, travel costs, heating and lighting. Now, travel, you can argue that, you know, it'll vary with the quantity of travel, but there will be costs associated to running the business that will have to be paid each week or month that you have to budget for as you start out. So thinking about costs and thinking about who the funders are is the first step in thinking about finance. And our next step then will be, as I said, taking the guide to getting finance. And in our next little clip, we're going to look at actually how we manage the finances and more detail on costings.